The wind in the Arizona Territory had a voice, and in the late autumn of 1883, it spoke of ending. It was a dry, rasping sound that scoured the life from the land, a relentless whisper that promised a long, cold winter. It swept down from the Needleback Mountains, funneled through the canyons, and spread across the Sage-Glass Basin like a ghostly tide. It carried with it the fine, red dust of the earth, a powder so persistent it settled into the grain of every fence post, the folds of every blanket, and the lines etched around a man's eyes. Here, at the edge of the basin, lay Starfall Range, a name far more poetic than the 160 acres of hard-bitten land it described. The wind found little to resist. It sliced through the sparse clumps of rabbit brush and brittle grama grass, making them bow in unison. It clawed at the split-rail fence, leaving a thin, gritty film on the weathered wood, like a layer of rust. The ranch belonged to a man as quiet as the stones that littered his fields, Rowan Pike. Rowan's world was one of straight lines and sharp angles, a life measured in the precise stacking of firewood and the neat mending of tack. He had inherited this solitude 7 years ago, the day the timber supports in the Silver Serpent mine had given way, burying his older brother, Caleb, under 1,000 tons of Arizona rock. Caleb had been the laughter, the noise, the easy conversation. Rowan was the shadow that remained. His cabin, built of sturdy ponderosa pine, stood against the vast, empty sky, a solitary bastion of order. Inside, the floor was swept clean. The single blanket on his cot was pulled taut, and the tin plates were stacked in perfect alignment on a rough-hewn shelf. It was a tidiness born not of pride, but of a need to control the few things a man could in a land governed by chaos. The silence within those four walls was absolute, a heavy, pressing thing that Rowan had learned to wear like a second skin. The only sound was the one he'd allowed from the outside world, a set of brass wind chimes Caleb had hung from the porch eaves years ago. On days like this, they clattered a frantic, discordant melody against the wind's steady moan. A lonely conversation between the living and the dead. Down in Dry Creek Pass, the nearest collection of buildings that aspired to be a town, the wind carried whispers of a different sort. Talk, like dust, got everywhere. The name on everyone's lips was the Voss Holden Syndicate, a cattle company from back east with deep pockets and a thirst for water that outmatched the desert itself. The rumors claimed they weren't buying land so much as strangling it. They'd use the law when it suited them, citing obscure water rights statutes that no small rancher could afford to fight in court. And when the law was too slow, they used men with guns, one by one. The seasonal streams and hard-dug wells that kept the small ranches alive were being fenced off, rerouted, or simply claimed. The syndicate was a slow-moving python, and the Sage-Glass Basin was feeling the squeeze. Rowan heard the talk on his rare trips for salt and flour, but he kept to himself. Starfall Range had a deep well, one that had never run dry, a fact he kept as guarded as a prayer. It was his anchor in this shifting, thirsty land. He had his brother's memory, his well, and his silence. He believed it was enough. That night, the wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound, something sharp and desperate that cut through the chime's metallic clamor. It was the frantic, irregular drumming of hoofbeats, pushed far too hard, and the splintering crack of wood. Rowan was on his feet before the sound fully registered, his hand moving instinctively toward the Winchester leaning by the door. Through the cabin's single window, he saw a shape burst through the front gate, not slowing, but careening into the yard. It was a light buckboard, pulled by a single, lathered horse. The iron-rimmed wheels screamed as they tore through the thin grass, gouging dark lines in the earth before grinding to a halt not 20 yards from his porch. The sudden silence that followed was more alarming than the noise had been. A figure, small and cloaked in shadow, practically fell from the driver's seat. It was a woman. She stumbled, caught herself, and stood for a moment, her head bowed against the wind. In her arms, she clutched a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, holding it to her chest like a newborn child. Rowan moved onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. The wind chimes sang their frantic song above his head. The woman looked up, her face a pale oval in the faint starlight, framed by hair that had come loose from its pins and whipped around her like dark ribbons. She took a hesitant step toward the cabin, then another, before a racking cough doubled her over. It was a dry, painful sound, the cough of someone who had swallowed too much of the desert. He could see her more clearly now. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, ugly bruise was beginning to form on the exposed skin. She was young, perhaps younger than his own 28 years, but her eyes held a weariness that spoke of decades. He expected a plea for help, for sanctuary. He was wrong. She straightened up, her gaze locking onto his. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady, devoid of panic. "Do you have a deep well?" she asked, the words almost snatched away by the wind. "One they can't poison or fence off overnight." She took another shaky breath. "They'll burn everything. They'll burn it all to the ground until I'm silenced." Her directness threw him. Rowan's eyes narrowed, taking in the details. The expensive but travel-worn fabric of her dress, the fine leather of her worn-out boots, and the raw, red mark circling her left wrist, stark against her pale skin, the ghost of a rope. He looked past her, toward the broken gate and the dark expanse of the basin beyond. For a moment, he saw nothing but the familiar, empty landscape. Then, he saw them. Three pinpricks of light, bobbing in the distance. Torches, moving slowly, deliberately, like the eyes of predators casting about for a lost trail. "They're from the syndicate," the woman said, following his gaze. She didn't need to elaborate. Her name was Ivy Durant. She explained in short, clipped sentences, as if conserving every breath, until 3 days ago. She had been the chief bookkeeper for the Mesa Plains Freighting Company, a business that had recently, and foolishly, entered into a hauling contract with Voss Holden. She unwrapped a corner of her oilcloth bundle, revealing the corner of a thick, leather-bound ledger. Inside, she said, was proof of falsified payrolls listing the names of men long dead, invoices for tons of phantom feed, charged to the syndicate for cattle herds that never existed. It was a scheme of immense scale, designed to defraud investors and, more importantly, to create a paper trail of expenses that could be leveraged as debt against the very ranchers whose water they were stealing. The architects of the fraud were the syndicate's owner, Ephraim Voss, and his lead enforcer, a ruthless man named Sutter Kane. Rowan remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had heard both those names in Dry Creek Pass. Voss was the snake's head, rarely seen, a figure of distant power. Kane was his fang, a man known for his cold efficiency and the casual cruelty with which he carried out Voss's orders. The torchlights in the distance were Kane's men. He made his decision without a word. He stepped off the porch, walked past her to the large barn, and slid the heavy wooden door open. The familiar scent of hay and horse leather rolled out. He then turned to the lantern hanging from a hook on the side of the cabin, its flame fluttering wildly in the wind, and with a quick puff of breath, extinguished it, plunging the yard into near total darkness. He gestured for her to bring the buckboard into the barn. She handled the horse with a surprising competence, her hands firm and gentle on the reins as she coaxed the exhausted animal into the barn's dark interior. Rowan followed, pulling the door shut behind them, sealing them in a world of blackness and scent. He lit a small, shielded stable lantern, its glow soft and contained. Without speaking, he unhitched the horse, led it to a stall, and began removing its harness. He then grabbed a heavy canvas tarp and threw it over the buckboard, the thick material draping over the wheels and shafts, erasing its shape. He kicked loose hay around its base, obscuring it further. In the dim light, it was just another lump in the shadows of a working barn. When he was done, he turned back to her. She was watching him, her back pressed against the rough-hewn wall, the ledger still clutched in her arms. He motioned toward the cabin. Inside, he poured water from a clay pitcher into a tin cup and handed it to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it, and she drank it down in 3 long swallows, her throat working. He refilled it, and she drank again. more slowly this time. The water seemed to settle her. The frantic energy that had propelled her to his door began to recede, replaced by a sharp, focused intelligence. They were tracking the North Rim Trail, she said, her voice stronger now. Kane is smart. He'll assume I'd double back toward Dry Creek Pass, thinking I could lose them in the foothills. He'll send 2 men that way, but he'll send his main party south, sweeping the basin. He knows anyone running would look for an isolated ranch, a place with water. Her eyes met his over the rim of the cup. They'll check every homestead between here and the San Pedro River. She spoke with the cool, analytical precision of someone who saw the world as a series of calculations, a balance of assets and liabilities. The pursuers on her trail were not monsters in the dark. They were a logistical problem to be solved. Rowan walked to the window and peered through a small gap in the curtains. The torchlights were closer now, spreading out, a net being cast across the darkness. He felt the familiar weight of the world pressing in, the quiet of his life disturbed by a violence he had long sought to avoid. He had spent 7 years building these walls, both physical and emotional, to keep such trouble out. Now, trouble had broken down his gate and was sitting at his table. He thought of Caleb, of the stories he would tell of helping folks stranded in a storm or down on their luck. Caleb's world had been full of people, of obligations, of connections. Rowan's was empty by design. Yet, looking at the marks on this woman's wrist and the grim determination in her eyes, he felt a flicker of his brother's spirit, an echo of a duty he thought he'd buried. The wind howled, rattling the window pane. It felt as if the desert itself was trying to force its way in, to reclaim this small pocket of warmth and light. He turned from the window, his mind made up. The risk was enormous. Harboring her was an act of defiance against the most powerful men in the territory. It would invite a wrath that could burn Starfall Range to the ground. But turning her away, sending her back into the dark with those lights drawing ever closer, was a choice he could not make. His nod was almost imperceptible, a slight dip of his chin. "You'll stay the night," he said. The words felt foreign in the silent cabin, loud and final. Ivy Durant looked at him, her gaze unwavering. She slid the tin cup back onto the table, her knuckles white where she gripped the ledger. "I don't accept charity," she stated, her voice clear and firm. "I'll pay with the truth." A fragile contract was sealed in the heart of the storm. Outside, the wind scoured the land, and the torchlights of Sutter Kane's men continued their patient, methodical search. Inside the small cabin, 2 strangers sat in a shared silence, listening to the desert breathe. The quiet of Starfall Range was no longer empty. It was now filled with the weight of a dangerous secret and the faint, uncertain glimmer of a promise. The small cabin, once a bastion of Rowan's solitary existence, transformed into a command center lit by the single, steady flame of a kerosene lamp. The wind still battered the walls, a constant reminder of the hostile world outside. But within, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of ink, paper, and quiet fury. Ivy Durant carefully untied the oilcloth, her movements precise and economical. She laid the syndicate's ledger on Rowan's rough-hewn table, the dark leather cover seeming to absorb the lamp's glow. When she opened it, the pages lay flat, their crispness a testament to her meticulous care. The book was a work of art and a masterpiece of deception. Her handwriting was flawless, a series of elegant, uniform numbers and letters that marched across the pages in perfect columns. It was the handwriting of a person who believed in order, in the clear, unambiguous truth of mathematics. But the story it told was a lie. "It starts here," she said, her voice low and steady. She pointed a slender finger at a column-headed supplemental fodder. "Voss Holden claims a herd of nearly 5,000 head grazing north of the basin. An expensive herd to maintain. They bill their eastern investors for massive quantities of grain and hay, especially during the dry season." Her finger traced a line to a corresponding entry, a payment signed off to Mesa Plains for hauling. "That's my old company. We were contracted to deliver this feed. The problem is, the herd doesn't exist. We hauled wagon loads of rocks and sand to drop-off points in the middle of nowhere, all documented as feed. She flipped a few pages. And here, the payroll. The column listed names, followed by weekly wages. Jacob Miller, Thomas Finch, Elias Thorne. She paused, her eyes hardening. I checked the records in Dry Creek Pass. Miller and Finch died of fever 3 years ago. Thorne was killed in a bar fight in '79. They are the syndicate's most reliable employees. They never complain. Rowan stared at the names of the dead men, at the neat figures beside them. It was a cold, calculated theft that went beyond money. It stole a man's name, his very memory, and turned it into a tool for greed. All the money, Ivy continued. The phantom payments, the ghost wages. It has to go somewhere. It's funneled through a network of intermediaries, but it always ends with one man collecting the cash. Her finger landed decisively on a name that appeared again and again, linked to disbursements with no clear purpose. Lyle Briscoe. I believe he's their paymaster. He turns the paper figures back into coin. For a long moment, Rowan said nothing. He looked from the ledger to Ivy, and back again. He had lived his life by the tangible truths of the land, the heft of an axe, the feel of rain, the position of the stars. This book was a foreign country, a world of abstract deceit he couldn't grasp, but he had his own book of truths. He crossed to a large, flat-topped chest that sat beneath the window, the only piece of furniture besides the table and bed. He lifted the heavy lid, and from beneath a stack of folded blankets, he withdrew a roll of tanned buckskin. He spread it out on the floor, for it was too large for the table. It was a map, drawn by hand in charcoal and ink, filled with fine lines, strange symbols, and cryptic notes. For 7 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. I've walked this land. Every season, I learned where the water goes when it vanishes from the surface. It was a stunning piece of work, a secret cartography of the Sage-Glass Basin. He had charted the hidden aquifers, the deep underground veins of water that fed the wells and gave life to the desert. His finger, calloused and blunt, pointed to a section of the map marked with a bold, dark line. Silver Wash. It runs for 10 miles, all underground. Fed 3 of the best wells in the southern basin. Or it did. He looked at Ivy. Last spring, the syndicate put up a fence, claimed it was their property line. The ranchers who owned those wells, the Hendersons and the Garzas, they protested. The syndicate showed them a deed filed with the Territorial Land Office, legal. A month later, their wells ran dry. He tapped the map. They didn't just fence the land, they dammed the source. Ivy knelt on the floor beside him, her eyes tracing the lines of his map, then darting back to the ledger on the table. A connection was forming, a bridge between her world of numbers and his world of earth and water. The deliveries, she said, a new urgency in her voice. The phantom feed deliveries, they weren't random. She scrambled back to the table, flipping through the freighting schedules in the back of the ledger. Look, 3 deliveries a week, always to the same sector. She cross-referenced the delivery coordinates with Rowan's map. Her finger landed on a spot a few miles east of the dammed Silver Wash. They match. The drop-off point is right here. Rowan stared at the location. There's nothing there, nothing but a collapsed salt depot. Old prospectors used it 50 years ago. Salt Finch Hollow. Exactly. Ivy breathed. An abandoned depot, the perfect place to store things you don't want found. They weren't just dumping the rocks there. Rowan, they were creating a paper trail, a record of activity linked to that specific location. It's where they're hiding the real books, the primary ledgers, the documents that would prove men like Lyle Briscoe are on their payroll, that the land deeds are fraudulent. This ledger, she patted the book on the table, is just the bait. The real evidence is in that hollow. She then explained the true, venomous genius of Voss's plan. The money they were stealing wasn't just for enrichment. They were using a mechanism called a public advance. The syndicate would declare these inflated operational costs the phantom feed, the ghost wages as legitimate business expenses. They would then petition the territorial authorities, arguing that these costs were necessary to develop the region and secure grants and tax deferments. Worse, they would use this manufactured debt to secure liens against neighboring properties, claiming a right to the water sources of ranchers who were struggling, effectively turning them into indentured servants on their own land. It was a debt trap, sprung with paper and ink, and enforced with fences and guns. A sudden scrape of wood on wood from outside broke the spell. Rowan was instantly on his feet, moving to the door, the Winchester now firmly in his hand. He peered out into the darkness. The torchlights were gone. The basin was a sea of black, but the absence of light was not the absence of threat. He slipped out, melting into the shadows. Ivy watched from the doorway, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. He was gone for several long minutes. When he returned, his face was a grim mask. He held up his hand. In his palm were fresh splinters of wood. "The fence posts by the well," he said, his voice tight. "Someone's been testing them. There are fresh knife marks all along the top rail. They didn't just ride past. Someone was on foot, right here in the yard, watching. They know about the well. They just don't know you're here yet. The hunt was not over. It had simply paused." They moved back inside, the sense of urgency now a palpable thing. "The buckboard," Ivy said. "The right rear wheel is split. I tied it with rope to get here, but it won't hold for another mile." "We'll fix it," Rowan said. A plan began to form in the space between them, built of their shared knowledge and desperation. And the well. If they come back, they'll come for the water. We need to make them think it's not worth the trouble. Their tasks were divided without discussion. Ivy, taking a small tool roll from her buckboard, began the patient work of mending the broken wheel spoke. She worked with a focused competence that surprised Rowan. In the barn's dim light, she was no longer just a bookkeeper, but a survivor. Rowan, meanwhile, took down the simple wooden sign that hung from a post beside his well. It read Starfall Range, fresh water. He carried it into his small workshop and, using a hot iron, carefully burned new letters into the wood. When he was finished, he hung it back up, in the moonlight. The sign now offered a different message. Well gone dry. It was a small deception, but in the desert, the promise of water was everything. A dry well was just another piece of useless land. They worked through the night, the only sounds the scrape of Ivy's tools and the hiss of Rowan's iron. They established a system of signals, simple and silent. 3 soft taps on the old copper kettle that sat on the cold stove would mean safety. And all clear. A single, sharp puff of air into a small ceramic whistle Rowan kept on his mantle. A bird call his brother had carved would mean immediate danger, as the first hints of dawn threatened to lighten the eastern sky. Ivy finished her work on the wheel. She wiped grease from her hands with a rag. Her face smudged, but her eyes clear. She looked at Rowan, a silent question in her gaze. "I need a knife," she said. "Not a request, but a statement of fact." Rowan hesitated for only a second. He went to the chest again, and from a small, leather-wrapped bundle, he took out a blade. It was a Green River knife, its blade worn smooth from years of use, its handle made of dark, polished mesquite. It had been Caleb's. Rowan ran his thumb over the handle, where his brother had long ago carved a single word into the wood stay. It was a word of stubbornness, of endurance, a command to hold one's ground. He held it out to her, handle first. Ivy took it. The knife felt solid, balanced in her palm. Her fingers closed around the handle, her thumb finding the carved letters. She felt the history in it, the silent strength. Her gaze met Rowan's, and in her eyes, he saw not fear, but a flicker of fire, a reflection of his own resolve. Before they rested, there was one last piece of the puzzle. On a high shelf, covered in a fine layer of dust, was a small collection of books. Among them was a thick, buckram-bound volume, The Compiled Laws of the Territory of Arizona. Ivy took it down as if it were as precious as her ledger. She scanned the table of contents, her finger stopping on a chapter heading, Water Rights and Riparian Claims. She spent the next hour poring over the dense, legalistic text, the lamplight glinting off her focused expression. With a piece of charcoal, she began to make small, neat marks in the margins, bracketing paragraphs. underlining sentences. She was finding loopholes, precedents, clauses that defined public access and condemned the illegal obstruction of a natural watercourse. She was discovering the language of the enemy and learning how to turn it against them. They were about to extinguish the lamp when they both saw it, a sliver of white appearing in the crack beneath the cabin door. It was a piece of cloth, pushed through from the outside. Rowan moved silently, picking it up. It was a scrap torn from a flour sack. Scrawled on it in crude charcoal were 3 lines: "Sell the well, return the ledger, or burn." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of Sutter Kane. He was closer than they had ever imagined. In a single, swift movement, Rowan blew out the lamp, plunging the room into absolute darkness. He pulled Ivy down, and they sat with their backs against the cold interior wall, facing the door. The Winchester laid across Rowan's lap. They listened for what felt like an eternity. There was only the sound of the wind and their own ragged breathing. Then they heard it, the crunch of a boot on the gravelly soil, slow and deliberate. And then another. The footsteps were heavy, confident. They paused right outside the door, then slowly faded as the person walked away. The night was not over. The threat was no longer a distant light, but a physical presence just a few feet away. They were trapped, yet, in the shared darkness, a strange sense of calm settled over them. Their hurried preparations, their shared discoveries, had forged a fragile alliance into something harder, something more resilient. Ivy's whisper was barely audible above the wind. "I used to keep the books for wicked men. I made their lies look like the truth." She drew a shaky breath. "Now I want those books to save people." Rowan's hand tightened on the stock of his rifle. He stared into the darkness, toward the door where their enemy had stood. "Truth," he answered, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was a promise and a prayer. "Truth needs a place to hide." The gray of the false dawn was colder than the night that had preceded it. It was a watery, uncertain light that offered no warmth, only visibility. Rowan and Ivy had not slept. The discovery of the warning scrap under their door had extinguished any possibility of rest. It was a declaration that Sutter Kane was no longer a distant threat, but a physical presence, a shadow walking the perimeter of their world. The hourglass had been turned, and the sand was running. They moved in silence, saddling 2 of Rowan's hardiest horses, a tough bay gelding for him and a slightly smaller roan mare for Ivy. Rowan carried his Winchester in its scabbard and a coil of good rope. Ivy had Caleb's knife, the one marked "Stay," tucked securely into her belt, and the implements of her own trade, a small pouch containing a vial of ink, a stylus, and a piece of chalk in her pocket. They did not ride the main trail. Rowan led them on a long, circuitous route, heading west first, as if toward Dry Creek Pass, before cutting south into a labyrinth of arroyos and washes that were invisible from the basin floor. He knew this land as he knew the lines on his own hand. He moved the horses over rock to avoid leaving tracks in the sand, favoring the high, stony ground where the wind would scrub their passage clean. After 2 hours of tense, silent riding, the terrain changed. The sparse sagebrush gave way to cracked, white alkali flats that crunched under the horses' hooves. The air grew sharp, metallic. Saltfinch Hollow was not a hollow at all, but a deep, narrow fissure in the earth, a scar left by some ancient, violent upheaval. It stank of 1,000 years of dryness, of minerals, and of the faint, pervasive tang of rust. Rowan dismounted, his movements economical. "Stay with the horses, keep them quiet." "No," Ivy said, swinging down from the roan. Her knees buckled slightly from the long ride, but she steadied herself. "The chest will be locked. You are the guard. I am the key." He looked at her for a moment, seeing not the panicked woman who had arrived at his gate, but someone hardened by the same desert wind that shaped him. He nodded once. "Stay in the shadows. Make no sound." They tethered the horses deep in a cluster of ironwood, where they would be invisible from the air, and moved toward the fissure on foot. The entrance to the old depot was a narrow opening, half hidden by a rock slide. A heavy, plank-board door had been set into the rock. It was secured by a thick, formidable-looking iron padlock. its surface pitted with rust. Rowan took up a position 50 yards away, climbing partway up the canyon wall to a small ledge that gave him a clear view of the flats they had just crossed. He settled himself, the Winchester resting across his knees, and became as still as the rock he leaned against. Ivy approached the door. She looked at the lock, a complex piece of machinery far beyond a simple bolt. From the depths of her hair, she retrieved a single, slender hairpin made of dark steel. She straightened it, then bent a tiny, precise hook into the end. She inserted it into the keyhole, her other hand applying light pressure to the lock's shackle with a second, thicker pin. She closed her eyes, shutting out the world, focusing entirely on the tiny, intricate universe inside the lock. It was a stubborn, rusty mechanism. She felt the pins, one by one, feeling for the slight give, the minuscule click as each one caught. Her fingers ached with the strain. Time stretched. She heard the faint skitter of a lizard on the rocks, the distant cry of a hawk. Then, she heard Rowan make a sound, a low, soft hiss, like a snake in the dust. Her eyes snapped open, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked toward his position. He was motionless, but his head was tilted, listening. Far out on the flats, a faint plume of dust was rising against the new sun. 2 riders, moving fast, heading in their general direction. They weren't on the hunt. They were scouts, riding a patrol route. But if they cut north, they would pass right by the hollow. Ivy turned back to the lock, the threat lending a desperate, frantic energy to her hands. She pushed the pin. The 5th tumbler caught. The shackle sprang open with a loud, metallic clack that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent morning. She pulled the door open on scraping iron hinges and slipped inside. The smell hit her first dry salt, old leather, and the acidic bite of bat guano. Light filtered in through a single, small ventilation shaft in the roof, illuminating a small, cave-like room. Against the back wall sat a single, heavy wooden chest. It was bound in iron, and the lid was sealed to the base not with a lock, but with thick daubs of dried red mud, each one stamped with a clear, unmistakable seal, the VH of the Voss Holden Syndicate. She used Caleb's knife to quickly, carefully chip away the mud seals. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, it was not gold or cash. It was paper. Dozens of ledgers, identical to the one she had taken, were stacked in neat rows. Beside them were canvas bags, boxes of invoices, and thick folders tied with string. She wasted no time. She knew the fraud. Now she needed the architecture of the conspiracy. She bypassed the duplicate ledgers and went for the invoice boxes. Her fingers, stained with red dust and grease, flew through the papers. She found it, a thick sheaf of payment vouchers. Not to Mesa Plains, but to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. But the payments were authorized by Lyle Briscoe, not the agency itself, and they were for security services in areas where there was nothing to secure. It was a ghost payroll for a ghost army, a squad of hired guns paid for by syndicate investors, posing as legitimate lawmen. Then she found the second, more important file. It was labeled Kite's Bluff Depot Supplies. It contained receipts for grain, for lumber, for dynamite, all shipped to a location. Kite's Bluff, that Ivy knew for a fact was nothing but a barren mesa, an uninhabited stretch of rock. It was the phantom location, the black hole on the map, where all the money and supplies officially went. It was the physical headquarters of their shadow operation. She pulled the key documents, the original, signed vouchers for the fake Pinkertons, and the master shipping manifest for Kite's Bluff. These were the papers with the wet ink signatures of Voss's lieutenants, the undeniable proof that linked the men to the crime. She couldn't take the chest, and she couldn't leave a gaping hole. She pulled 2 or 3 papers from the middle of each stack, where their absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. She quickly retied the bundles. With a piece of chalk from her pocket, she made a tiny, almost invisible mark on the inside cover of the primary ledger, the one she hadn't taken, a mark she could identify later in court. She closed the lid. She couldn't replace the mud seals, but she could mask their work. She took the chipped-off pieces of dried mud, ground them into powder in her palm, and mixed it with a few drops of water from the canteen Rowan had insisted she carry. She created a thin paste and carefully smeared it back over the broken seals, making it look as though the chest had simply been jostled, the old mud cracking from dryness. It wouldn't hold against a close inspection, but it would buy them time. She slipped back out into the light, pulling the heavy door shut and snapping the padlock closed. She looked up at Rowan. He was already on his feet, signaling to her. The riders, they were closer. "They're taking the North Fork," he whispered, his voice urgent as she reached his side. "It'll bring them right over us. We have to wait them out." He pulled her down behind the ledge, pressing them both flat against the rock. The space was barely large enough for one. Ivy found herself pressed against Rowan's side, his solid warmth a stark contrast to the cold stone at her back. The two riders were visible now, silhouettes against the rising sun. They were syndicate men, rifles held across their saddles, their faces shaded by the wide brims of their hats. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying clearly in the thin air. They rode onto the ridge directly above the fissure, not 50 feet from where Rowan and Ivy lay hidden. A few loose pebbles, dislodged by a horse's hoof, tumbled down the rock face, landing near Ivy's boot. She froze, every muscle tensed. She could feel the steady, slow beat of Rowan's heart against her shoulder. She held her breath, terrified that the small, white puff of it in the cold air would betray them. Rowan saw it, slowly, deliberately. He unwrapped the faded bandana from his neck. It smelled of sage and sweat and the faint, clean scent of the wind. He pressed it gently into her hand. Ivy understood. She raised the cloth to her mouth and nose, breathing into the fabric, her terror muffled by the scent of him. The riders paused at the edge of the ridge, scanning the basin below. One of them spat a stream of tobacco onto the rocks. "Nothing," he called out. "Same as yesterday. Nothing but snakes and lizards." "Let's get back to the wash," the other replied. "Kane wants us back before noon." They spurred their horses, disappearing over the ridge. Rowan and Ivy didn't move for a full minute. The silence that returned was profound. "Now," Rowan said, helping her to her feet. They scrambled down the rocks and ran to their horses. They mounted, and Rowan led them, not back the way they came, but deeper into the canyon. They had to assume the scouts would look back. They were rounding a sharp bend when a voice high above them yelled, "Hold down there." One of the scouts had stayed behind, or circled back. He was on the ridge above, a black figure against the bright sky. Ivy felt a cold dread seize her. They were caught. A shot rang out, and the world dissolved into noise. The bullet wasn't aimed at them. It struck the canyon wall a foot from Ivy's head. A deliberate, terrifying warning. Clang! A spray of rock chips stung her cheek. Her mare screamed and reared, fighting the bit. "Go!" Rowan yelled, pulling his Winchester from its scabbard in one fluid motion. He didn't fire at the man. He aimed at the precarious slab of shale rock just above and to the left of the scout's horse. He fired once. The .44, 40 rounds struck the rock with a tremendous crack. The impact sent a spider web of fissures through the stone, and a large chunk of the ledge gave way, shattering on the rocks near the scout. The man's horse panicked, rearing in terror at the sudden, violent slide of rock. It spun in a tight circle, fighting its rider, its hooves dangerously close to the canyon's edge. The scout was too busy trying to control his mount to take another shot. He cursed them, his voice raw with fury. But he was pinned. Rowan had not harmed him, but he had cut off his pursuit. Now! Ivy Ride Rowan spurred his gelding, and they plunged into the shadow of the canyon. They rode hard for a mile, the sound of their own horses' hooves echoing off the walls, before turning sharply into a narrow, dry creek bed thick with thorny yucca and mesquite. The sharp, spiky plants tore at their clothes and legs, but the dense brush erased their trail. They followed the winding bed for miles, the sandy bottom muffling their hoofbeats, until it finally deposited them back onto the familiar, open plains of the Sage-Glass Basin, just south of Starfall Range. They returned to the cabin as the sun climbed toward noon. Their hands were scraped raw, Their faces streaked with dust and sweat, but they were alive. And they had the proof. On the relative safety of the porch, shielded from the sun. Ivy laid out the papers she had taken. The wind chimes above them played a soft, gentle melody, a counterpoint to the violent morning. She spread the vouchers for the fake Pinkertons and the Kite's Bluff manifest on the rough planking. She looked at Rowan, her eyes bright with a terrible clarity. It's all here. They built a timeline of lies. Her finger tapped the first voucher. First, they create the Phantom Army. They use them to intimidate ranchers, to enforce their legal claims, like the one at Silverwash. Her finger moved to the manifest. Then, they create a phantom headquarters at Kite's Bluff, a place to launder the money and stockpile the supplies they've stolen. It's a fortress built of paper. She sat back on her heels. From impersonation, to fraudulent advances, to seizing the wells. It's a perfect, closed loop of theft. Rowan stared at the papers, at the elegant, official-looking script that condemned men to ruin. He felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. Sutter Kane gave us an ultimatum. Sell, surrender, or burn. He thinks we're trapped. He stood up, his decision made, his voice final. We won't do any of them. We take this to Mistral Court. We take it to Judge Ada Bellwether. Ivy looked up, hope and fear warring in her expression. Bellwether, I've heard of her. They say she's the only judge in the territory the syndicates haven't been able to buy or intimidate. She's fair, Rowan said, and she fears nothing but God. But Mistral Court is 50 miles north, and to get there, we have to cross the Moonspan. A shadow passed over Ivy's face. The Moonspan Wind Bridge, a narrow, rickety suspension bridge strung across a 1,000-foot chasm. It was the only fast way north, and its southern approach, a twisting bottleneck of rock, was a known ambush point. It was Sutter Kane's favorite hunting ground. We can't fight our way across, Ivy said, her mind already working. Kane will have it watched. We need another way. We need safe passage. She stood abruptly and went inside the cabin. She returned with her small ink vial and a single sheet of clean paper. I have a friend, she said, smoothing the paper on the table. At least, I hope she's still a friend. Her name is Olive Marrow. She's a postal rider for the U.S., mail. They're federal. Even Kane and Voss wouldn't dare interfere with a mail wagon. Not openly. She dipped the pen and began to write. Her hand, which had trembled picking the lock, now perfectly steady. Her script was clean and fast. It was not a plea for help, but a request for logistics, asking when the next mail wagon would pass, and if it could carry 2 urgent passengers. When she was finished, she folded the letter. From a small tin in her satchel, she produced a stick of dark red wax and a small copper seal. She melted the wax over the lamp's flame, dripping it onto the paper's fold. She pressed the seal into the cooling wax. Rowan looked at the impression it left behind. It was not a crest or an initial. It was the intricate, detailed image of a single, blooming yucca flower, a symbol of the desert, of resilience, of survival. Now, Ivy said, holding the letter, we just have to find a way to get this to her. The day bled out of the sky, leaving behind streaks of bruised purple and soft, bruised orange. The fierce, wind-swept energy of their raid on Saltfinch Hollow had dissipated, replaced by the quiet, heavy tension of waiting. Rowan had found a way to get Ivy's letter to a prospector he trusted, a man who owed him a favor and who would see it delivered to Olive Marrow at the next mail stop. Now, there was nothing to do but wait for a reply that might never come. The world had shrunk to the size of Rowan's porch. Ivy sat on the top step, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening canvas of the sky. The wind had softened from a howl to a sigh, and it carried the clean, sharp scent of sage and the dry, sweet perfume of needlegrass. She was exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscle. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the lock-picking and the chase had left an ache in its wake, a bone-deep weariness that made the very air feel heavy. The trembling in her hands had finally stopped, but a finer tremor existed inside her, a constant vibration of fear and uncertainty. She heard the soft scuff of a boot on the planking behind her and knew it was Rowan. He didn't speak. He simply came and sat on the old wooden bench that leaned against the cabin wall, a few feet away from her. The silence between them was no longer the awkward quiet of strangers, but a comfortable, shared space. They had faced gunfire together. It had forged a bond stronger than years of conversation ever could. The temperature was dropping quickly, the desert giving up its stored heat to the night. A shiver traced its way up Ivy's spine. A quick, involuntary shudder. Rowan saw it. He rose, went back inside the cabin, and returned a moment later with a heavy, woven poncho. It was made of thick, undyed wool, patterned with simple stripes of gray and black. He didn't offer it. He simply stepped behind her and gently draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate and grounding. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and of him, a clean, earthy scent. The warmth began to seep into her clothes, a small, profound comfort that seemed to push back against the vast, cold emptiness of the basin. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling the edges of it together in front of her. He returned to his bench, and they sat watching the stars multiply. A silent scattering of diamond dust across black velvet. The universe felt immense, their own troubles small and insignificant beneath its silent, wheeling majesty. But the threat was not in the stars. It was down here, on the dark earth, and it felt anything but small. Still feeling the chill, still feeling the tremor deep inside her, Ivy made a decision. She stood up from the step and moved to the bench. She sat at the far end, leaving a respectable distance between them. But the wind was clever. It found the gap, curling around the porch post to whisper against her cheek. Without thinking, she shifted closer to Rowan, seeking the simple shelter of his larger frame. He felt the small movement, saw her press herself against the back of the bench to escape the draft. He hesitated for only a heartbeat. This was a territory far more uncharted than the one on his buckskin map. Then, slowly, as if asking a question he didn't know how to voice, he raised the arm that was nearest to her, resting it along the back of the bench. It was not an embrace, but an invitation, an offering of space, of shelter. "It's all right," the gesture seemed to say. "You can come closer." Ivy looked at the space he had created. In that moment, it was the safest harbor she had ever seen. The fear of what Kane would do, the exhaustion, the gnawing uncertainty, it all seemed to recede in the face of that simple, quiet gesture. She did not slide across the bench. Instead, in a movement that was both graceful and weary, she turned, drew her legs up, and settled herself sideways on his lap, her back resting against the solid wall of his chest. It was an act of profound, startling trust. Her worn traveling skirt, creased from days of riding and hiding, fell away slightly from her knee as she settled. She tucked her feet beneath the poncho, and with a small sigh that seemed to release all the tension of the day, she let her head rest in the hollow just below his chin. For a long moment, Rowan didn't move, didn't breathe. He was poleaxed. The reality of her was a shock to his system, which had been calibrated to solitude for 7 long years. She was light, yet substantial. He could feel the warmth of her through his shirt, the soft weight of her head against his collarbone. He was acutely aware of the scent of her hair, of the dust and the wind that clung to it. Then, he let out the breath he had been holding. His arm, which had been resting on the back of the bench, came down to settle on her back. His hand was large and rough, the palm and fingers calloused from a lifetime of hard labor. But his touch was incredibly gentle. It was a steady, respectful pressure, solid, reassuring, a silent promise of protection. It was a placement that offered support without demand, comfort without condition. His hand did not move, did not explore. It simply rested there, a warm, firm anchor in a sea of fear. Slowly, unconsciously, their breathing began to fall into the same rhythm, a slow, deep inhale and exhale that seemed to match the quiet pulse of the desert night. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. The silence was finally broken by Ivy's voice, small and soft against his chest. "What was your favorite thing to eat when you were a boy?" The question was so unexpected, so disarmingly normal, that Rowan had to think for a moment. "My mother," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "She used to make a peach cobbler. With cinnamon, she'd cook it in a Dutch oven, right in the coals of the fire. The top would be all crisp and brown." He could almost taste it, a sweet, warm ghost on his tongue. "What about you?" "My father was a printer," she said. "He always smelled of ink and paper. On Sundays, he would take me to a little bakery in town, and he'd buy me a lemon tart. It was so sour it made your mouth pucker, but the crust was buttery and sweet." She smiled, a sad, sweet expression he could feel more than see. "It's funny, the things you remember." "It is," he agreed. They fell silent again. But the small exchange had changed the texture of the air between them. They were no longer just a rancher and a bookkeeper, allies in a desperate fight. They were Rowan, who missed his mother's cobbler, and Ivy, who missed her father and the taste of lemon tarts. "What are you afraid of now?" "Rowan," she asked, her voice even quieter than before. "I don't mean Kane, or the syndicate. I mean really afraid of—" It was a question no one had asked him in 7 years, a question he had never truly asked himself. He thought of the long winters, the silent meals, the crushing emptiness of the cabin after Caleb's death, the quiet. He answered, the admission costing him more than she could ever know. "I'm afraid of this house staying empty, of the silence getting so loud it swallows everything else." She nodded against his chest, a small, understanding movement. "I'm afraid of numbers," she whispered. "I used to love them. They were perfect, unchanging. 2 + 2 was always 4, a column of figures always balanced. There was a truth to it. And then I saw how men like Voss could take that truth and bend it, how they could twist numbers into weapons, into cages for other people. I'm afraid of the best part of my mind being used for the worst reasons." At that moment, a gust of wind swept across the porch, and the brass chimes his brother had hung so long ago rang out, a clear, melodic sequence of notes against the night. Ivy laughed, a soft, genuine sound that was startlingly beautiful. "Even your wind has a voice." "This sound," Rowan said, his own voice thick with memory. "It saved me, I think, through many dry seasons. Sometimes, it was the only other voice out here. It reminded me that even when you feel the most alone, something is still moving. The world is still turning." His confession hung in the air between them, a profound and vulnerable truth. Ivy shifted, tilting her head back to look up at him. Her face was a pale, heart-shaped blur in the starlight, her eyes vast and dark. In their depths, he saw the reflection of the same stars that shone above them. The space between their faces, which had been a universe, shrank to nothing. The kiss, when it came, was as natural and inevitable as the rising of the moon. It was not a kiss of passion, or of desperate, stolen heat. It was a kiss of gratitude. It was slow and warm, and it spoke a language of pure, undiluted comfort. It was the taste of cool water after a day in the sun. It said, with a simple meeting of lips, "You are safe." And it answered, "I know." When they parted, neither of them moved. Rowan's hand, which had been resting on her back, slid down to her waist, his thumb stroking gently over the coarse fabric of her dress. It was a gesture of possession, but not of ownership. It was the touch of a man who had found something precious and was terrified of letting it go. Ivy's own hand came up and covered his, her small fingers pressing into the back of his knuckles. "Don't go anywhere," she whispered, the words a plea and a command. They were startled by a soft, metallic clinking from the corral. One of the horses, shifting in its sleep, had bumped its harness against the water trough. The sound was a gentle reminder of the world beyond the porch, of the journey that still lay ahead. With a reluctant sigh, Ivy slowly, carefully, moved to stand. She smoothed the front of her dress, her hand lingering for a moment where her skirt had fallen away from her knee. She felt exposed, not physically, but emotionally. She had let him see the fear and the weariness she had kept so carefully hidden, and he had not run from it. He had sheltered it. She looked at him, and he saw that the deep, weary shadows in her eyes had been replaced by a new light, a gleam that was brighter and clearer than the stars overhead. No vows had been spoken. No promises of a future had been made. But something had been sealed between them on that porch, a silent contract written not in ink, but in a shared breath, a quiet confession, a single, tender touch of lips. It was the signing of the first page of a story they had not yet realized they were writing together. As if to punctuate the moment, a sudden, brilliant slash of silver light tore across the sky, a meteor, burning a fleeting, incandescent trail through the darkness. The Bitterglass Comet, the old-timers called it, a rare visitor to their skies. They both saw it. They both looked at each other. And in the fading, ghostly light of its passage, they both smiled. It felt like a sign, an omen, a confirmation that for the first time in a long time, they had both made a choice that was unequivocally, breathtakingly right. The signal came not as a letter, but as a sliver of light. Just after dawn, Rowan, who had taken the first watch on the cabin roof, saw it 3 quick, deliberate flashes from a mirror, reflecting the sunrise from the crest of Miller's Ridge, 5 miles distant. It was Olive Marrow's sign. The mail convoy was running on schedule. They would reach the Moonspan Wind Bridge at noon, and Judge Bellwether would be waiting. There was no time for contemplation. The quiet intimacy of the previous night, the shared breath under the stars, evaporated in the harsh, practical light of morning. This was a day for survival, not sentiment. Rowan moved with a grim efficiency. The documents from Saltfinch Hollow, the wet ink vouchers for the Phantom Pinkertons, the shipping manifests for the non-existent depot at Kite's Bluff were the heart of their case. They were the steel trap that would close on Ephraim Voss. He packed them tightly into a small, sturdy pine box, stuffing the gaps with raw wool to keep the papers from shifting. He then placed this box inside a much larger, rough-hewn crate with a shovel. He filled the rest of the crate with heavy, red Arizona dirt and loose rock, burying the small box in its center. He nailed the lid shut and, with a piece of branding chalk, scrawled ore samples on the side. It was a heavy, awkward, and thoroughly uninteresting burden. A thief might steal a wagon, but he'd likely abandon a crate of worthless rock. Rowan loaded the heavy crate onto the repaired buckboard, lashing it down securely. Ivy, meanwhile, prepared herself. She secured her own satchel, which contained the original ledger that had started her flight, under the driver's seat, in the deep, inner pocket of her skirt. She placed a single, folded sheet of paper, her meticulous, handwritten summary of the entire conspiracy. If they were separated, if the wagon was lost, the map of Voss's crimes, the key to the entire fraud, would survive. The 50-mile ride to Mistral Court was a silent, grueling race against the sun. They pushed the horses hard, Rowan handling the reins, his face a mask of concentration. The buckboard's wheels, one of them newly mended, rattled and groaned over the hardpan, a desperate rhythm against the silence. Rowan's eyes never stopped moving, scanning the horizon, the heat-shimmering ridges, the dark shadows of every cluster of yucca and ironwood. Every plume of dust in the distance was a potential threat, every hawk's cry a potential warning. Ivy sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She held Caleb's knife in her belt, its handle a solid, comforting weight against her side. They did not speak. Every word was a breath wasted, every breath a second lost. They reached the foothills of the Moonspan Canyon just as the sun touched its zenith. The Moonspan Wind Bridge was a marvel of desperation, a testament to the settlers who had refused to be beaten by geography. It was a narrow, swaying ribbon of wood and rope, strung over a chasm so deep the bottom was lost in shadow. The wind, funneled by the canyon walls, moaned through its thick support cables, a constant, mournful sound that gave the bridge its name. It was the only way across, and Sutter Kane was waiting for them. They saw the roadblock from a quarter-mile out. It wasn't subtle. A heavy iron chain was draped between the 2 massive stone pylons that anchored the bridge's southern end. Standing in front of it were 4 men, their horses tethered nearby. One of them, Rowan recognized instantly from descriptions in Dry Creek Pass. Sutter Kane. He was leaning against a pylon, casual, as if waiting for a stagecoach, idly polishing a silver concho on his belt. A newly painted, ridiculously official-looking sign had been hung from the chain. It read, "Moonspan Toll, $5. It was a joke, and a deadly one. Rowan pulled the wagon to a halt 30 yards from the chain. His hands, steady on the reins, did not tremble. $5 is steep for a bridge," Rowan called out, his voice calm, projecting easily in the thin, dry air. Kane pushed himself off the pylon, a slow, uncoiling movement like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. A grin split his sun-scorched face, revealing teeth stained dark by tobacco. "It's a special rate, Pike," he answered, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Just for you, and for the lady bookkeeper I know you've got in there." His cold eyes swept the wagon, lingering on Ivy. "We got your note, the one with the pretty flower. Seems your friend Olive is expecting you." Ivy's blood ran cold. He'd intercepted the message. This wasn't a random checkpoint. It was a trap laid specifically for them. "I'm just a rancher," Rowan said, letting a note of weary confusion enter his voice. "I don't know anything about a bookkeeper. We're hauling ore samples to the assayer in Mistral." "Is that a fact?" Kane chuckled. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of the revolver holstered at his hip. "Well, I'm afraid the assayer's closed, and I'm impounding these samples on behalf of the syndicate." As Rowan engaged Kane, Ivy was already moving. This was the contingency plan, the one they had rehearsed in whispers on the ride over. "If he knows, stall, I move." She slid her feet down, over the front of the wagon bed, onto the wide wooden tongue between the two horses. Rowan's body, and the angle of the sun, masked her movement from Kane and his men. In one silent, fluid motion, she dropped under the wagon, landing softly on the dusty ground. The wagon bed was high, built for rough country. She had perhaps 2 feet of clearance. She began to crawl, moving on her elbows and knees, toward the front of the bridge. "Now, that seems high-handed, even for the syndicate." Rowan continued, his voice steady. "This bridge is territorial property. You can't just block it. I can do whatever I please." Kane spat, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I've got the guns. That's the only law out here." Ivy reached the edge of the ground. Before her was the bridge planking. She could see the chasm through the gaps between the boards. A dizzying, terrifying drop that seemed to pull at her. The wind howled beneath her, a giant, unseen hand trying to rip her from the earth. She ignored it. Her goal was the massive iron support beam that ran along the underside of the wagon path. She reached the edge, her fingers gripping the cold, dusty iron, and swung her legs out over the void. She found a cross brace with her boot, locked her arm, and began to move, hand over hand, beneath the bridge, like a spider on a thread. Kane laughed again, a harsh, barking sound. "Hardware ore samples. I'm tired of this game. Pike." He nodded to his men. "Take the wagon." As 2 of his men moved toward the horses, Kane's eyes darted back to the driver's seat. He saw Rowan, but Ivy was gone. His smile vanished instantly. He scanned the wagon bed, the heavy tarp. Then he looked under it. He saw nothing but the bridge planking. His gaze snapped to the far side of the chasm. He understood. "Clever," he snarled, the mask of civility gone, revealing the predator beneath. "Clever little rat." With a furious boot, he kicked the toll sign aside. The chain dropped, and the sign clattered onto the rocks. From where it had been hanging, he retrieved his own rifle, a long-barreled Sharps, a buffalo gun, a weapon capable of hitting a target a mile away. He levered a heavy round into the chamber. At that exact moment, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the air. It came from the west, down the trail. Kane spun. A cloud of dust was rising, and at its head was the unmistakable shape of a U.S. mail wagon, drawn by a 6-mule team, moving at a full gallop. Beside it rode 2 armed outriders, their Winchesters held ready. Olive Marrow. She hadn't been intercepted. She was on time. The scissors were closing. Rowan didn't wait. He snapped the reins, roaring at the horses. Hya! The team lunged forward, the heavy wagon lurching onto the bridge. The sudden movement, combined with the mail wagon's approach, created a cloud of choking dust from the dry approach, momentarily obscuring Kane and his men. Kane roared in fury. He raised the sharps. He didn't aim at Rowan or the fleeing wagon. He aimed higher, at the main suspension cable where it connected to the pylon, the day-wrong rock, the primary rigging that held the entire structure aloft. A shot there would cripple the bridge, dropping them all into the canyon. He fired. The heavy slug screamed past Rowan's head, the concussion of its passage deafening. It smacked into the stone pylon, missing the vital cable by inches. A spray of granite chips exploded, and the vibration shuddered through the entire structure. Ivy, who was now halfway across, her hands raw and bleeding from the iron beam, felt the bridge heave beneath her. She didn't pause. She reached the far pylon and scrambled up from the beams, pulling herself onto the planking. In front of her was the bridge's barrier mechanism, a heavy wooden gate, currently raised and locked in place by a single, large iron retaining pin. It was designed to block the bridge during high winds. She grabbed the pin's handle. Kane's men were firing now, their pistol shots snapping through the air. Bullets whined past Rowan's head and thudded into the ore samples crate. Rowan fought the panicking horses, trying to keep the wagon centered on the narrow planks. Kane, seeing the mail wagon almost upon him, screamed at his men. "Block them! Stop the wagon!" Two of his gunmen spurred their horses forward, riding onto the bridge's entrance to intercept Rowan, right into the path of the mechanism Ivy was struggling with. Ivy gave a desperate cry, planting her feet, and pulled the heavy iron pin free. With a screech of tortured wood and metal, the heavy barrier gate, 8 feet wide and made of thick timber, swung free. It didn't just fall, it swung down and out, sweeping across the bridge's entrance like a giant arm. The 2 gunmen who had ridden forward were caught by it. It slammed into them and their horses, a solid wall of wood that knocked them backward in a tangle of limbs and panicked animals. It didn't break, it just blocked, a solid, immovable object that sealed the bridge's entrance. Kane and his men were trapped on the south side. The wagon was almost across, but the jolt from the sharps, combined with the horses' panic, had sent the right rear wheel skidding. It slid off the main planking, catching on the outer lip of the bridge, the iron rim hanging over 1,000 feet of empty air. The wagon tilted violently, its heavy, ore-filled crate threatening to tear the entire buckboard free. Rowan was off the seat before the wagon stopped moving. He jumped to the ground and threw his entire weight against the back of the wagon, his shoulder against the crate, trying to shove it back on track. The wagon was too heavy. It wouldn't budge. "Ivy, the rope!" he roared. "Ivy, on the other side!" Grabbed the coil of rope from the wagon bed. At that moment, the U.S. mail wagon skidded to a halt behind them, blocking the bridge's northern exit. Olive Marrow, a tough, wiry woman with a face like tanned leather, was off her seat, a shotgun in her hands. She saw the wagon, the men on the far side, and Rowan's desperate struggle. "Pull, girl, pull!" Olive yelled. Ivy and Olive grabbed the rope, wrapped it around the wagon axle, and pulled with all their strength. The outriders leveled their rifles at Kane. Rowan gave one final, desperate shove, his muscles screaming. With a groan of scraping wood on metal, the wheel lurched, caught the plank, and rolled back onto the bridge. "Get in!" Rowan yelled, scrambling back onto the driver's seat. On the far side, Kane was apoplectic. He was trapped behind his own men, the barrier, and the mail wagon's armed guards. He saw the outriders, their rifles aimed directly at him. He was beaten. "This isn't over! Pike!" he bellowed, his voice raw with hatred, a promise of retribution that was absolute. "I'll have that ledger, I'll take it back, and I'll pay for it with your blood." His men backed away from the barrier, raising their hands. Firing on federal mail agents was a hanging offense, and even Kane knew that line. Rowan didn't look back. He whipped the horses, and the buckboard shot forward, followed closely by the mail wagon. They were across. They were safe. They rode for a full mile before Rowan slowed the horses to a trot. Ivy was still holding the rope, her knuckles white. She let it go and slumped against the seat. Her entire body was shaking in the aftermath of the terror. She looked at her hand, which was black with grease and grime from the axle. Unconsciously, she pressed the back of her hand to her cheek, leaving a dark smudge on her pale skin. A single, choked sound escaped her half-sob, half-laugh. A shaky, trembling smile touched her lips. Rowan looked at her. He saw the grease on her face, the wildness in her eyes, the incredible, stubborn strength that held her together. He reached over, not to touch her, but just to let his hand rest on the seat between them. He nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement of what they had just survived. "We got our breath to the court," he said, his voice quiet. Ivy's smile faded. She looked back, south, toward the lands they had fled. A dark, thick column of smoke was rising in the far distance, smudging the clean blue sky. It was too much smoke for a chimney, too dark for a brush fire. It was rising from the direction of Kite's Bluff. "Voss," she whispered. "He's not waiting. He knows we have the proof. He's destroying the rest of it. He's mobilizing." The race was not over. It had just entered its final leg. Rowan snapped the reins again. Ahead of them, nestled in a valley carved by the only green river in the county, was Mistral Court. It was a single, stark, white building, surrounded by a grove of cottonwood trees, a small, defiant point of civilization in a vast, savage land. They urged the horses forward, the sound of their wheels a desperate prayer against the coming storm. The courtroom in Mistral was not a grand hall of justice. It was a small, spare room, smelling of dry ink, oiled wood, and the faint, dusty scent of law books that were rarely disturbed. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, lanced through two tall, wavy-paned windows, falling upon a floor of worn, scarred planking. It was a room built for function, not ceremony, a place where the raw, unvarnished truths of the frontier were meant to be hammered into something resembling order. At the head of this room, behind a bench of dark, imposing oak, sat Judge Ada Bellwether. She was a woman in her late 60s, her hair pulled back in a severe bun the color of spun silver. She wore no robes, only a simple, high-collared dress of dark gray wool. She did not need the vestments of power. She radiated an authority that was absolute and innate. Her face was a landscape of fine lines, a map of a life spent looking at people and seeing the truth, or the lack of it, in their eyes. And her eyes, they were the color of a winter sky, sharp and clear and reflective as polished steel. When she listened, she did so with her entire being, her stillness a palpable force in the room. The room was not empty. Ephraim Voss sat at a small table, flanked by a slick-and well-dressed lawyer from back east. Voss himself was the picture of bored arrogance, his expensive suit uncreased, his hands resting on the table. A large black onyx ring on his little finger was the only point of darkness in the light, a small, cold void. Across the narrow aisle sat Ivy, Rowan, and Olive Marrow. Judge Bellwether's gaze settled on Ivy. "You may begin. Miss Durant." Ivy stood. Her dress was still torn, her face smudged with the grime of their journey, but she stood straight. The syndicate ledger held not as a shield, but as a piece of evidence. She did not speak with passion or with pleading. She spoke with the cold, irrefutable logic of a mathematician laying out a proof. She opened the ledger on the witness stand. "Your Honor, this is a record of a lie told in numbers, which are meant to be the language of truth." Her hand, steady and precise, moved across the page. "It begins with fraudulent public advances. The Voss Holden Syndicate claimed staggering operational costs, securing territorial grants meant for legitimate development." Her finger traced a column. "These costs were manufactured. Here, you will see invoices for supplemental fodder, amounting to thousands of dollars a month, hauled by the Mesa Plains Freighting Company. These shipments were signed for by syndicate foremen at designated drop-off points." "And were these shipments delivered?" Judge Bellwether asked. her voice calm and even. "Yes, Your Honor," Ivy replied. "The wagons were delivered, but they were filled with sand and rock. The cattle they were meant to feed do not exist." A murmur went through the small gallery of townspeople who had gathered to watch. Voss's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, the witness is making baseless, slanderous accusations. She has no proof of the wagon's contents. I have the testimony of the woman who arranged the shipments." Olive Marrow called out from her seat. "You will have your turn." "Miss Marrow," the judge said, silencing Olive with a look. She turned to the lawyer. "Your objection is noted, Mr. Davies, and overruled. For now. Continue." "Miss Durant." Ivy's finger moved to another section. "The second pillar of the fraud is the payroll. This ledger lists dozens of paid employees, men like Jacob Miller and Thomas Finch." Her voice was level, but an edge of cold anger crept in. "According to the town records in Dry Creek Pass, both Mr. Miller and Mr. Finch died of fever in the winter of 1880. Yet, according to this book, they have been drawing a weekly wage for the past 3 years. Their wages, along with the payments for the phantom feed, were funneled through a single paymaster, a man named Lyle Briscoe, and converted to cash." "Mr. Davies was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Miss Durant is a disgruntled former employee, dismissed from Mesa Plains for theft and incompetence. She stole this ledger and has clearly fabricated this entire, fanciful story for the purposes of extortion." Voss did not move, but a thin, cruel smile touched his lips. He crossed his arms, the onyx ring gleaming. "Is this true?" Miss Durant, the judge asked, her steel-gray eyes fixed on Ivy. "Were you dismissed for theft?" "I was dismissed, Your Honor." "Yes," Ivy said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce clarity. "2 days after I presented my findings on these discrepancies to my superiors, I was given 10 minutes to clear my desk and was then pursued across the basin by armed men in the syndicate's employ." "And who are these men?" Before Ivy could answer, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Sutter Kane stood there, flanked by 3 of his hard-faced gunmen. They did not enter, but their presence was an invasion, a physical manifestation of the threat that had haunted the proceedings. They blocked the only exit, their hands resting near their holsters. The room fell silent. The townspeople in the gallery seemed to shrink in their seats. Judge Bellwether did not raise her voice. She did not look alarmed. She simply picked up her gavel and tapped it once on the oak bench. The sound was sharp, definitive, like a rifle shot. "Bailiff," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Inform Captain Miller of the town militia that his men are required to secure this courtroom immediately." She looked directly at Sutter Kane, her eyes as hard and unyielding as the landscape outside. "This is a court of law, Mr. Kane, not a saloon. You will remove your hats, and your hands will remain where I can see them." Kane hesitated, a flicker of disbelief on his face. He was not used to being challenged, but something in the old woman's gaze made him comply. He slowly, sullenly, removed his hat. His men followed suit, while the bailiff hurried out a side door. The testimony continued. Olive Marrow was called. She presented her own logbook, showing the official U.S. mail routes, Kite's Bluff. "Your Honor," she stated, her voice crisp, "the location listed as the syndicate's primary supply depot on these manifests. It's a phantom. There is no settlement there, no depot, no reason for a freight company to make 3 deliveries a week. It's a lie on paper, designed to fool investors and the territory." Then Rowan was called. He did not bring his map into the stuffy courtroom. He brought the truth of the land. His words were few, but they carried the weight of stone. "Ephraim Voss and his syndicate have illegally fenced off the headwaters of the Silver Wash," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I have followed the water under the ground for 7 years. I know where it runs. They have dammed it. The wells of the Henderson and Garza families, good people, have run dry because of it. Their deed to that land is a fraud, just like their ledger." Davies scoffed. "A fraudulent deed. And you would know this how, Mr. Pike? Are you a surveyor, a land agent?" "No," Rowan said simply. "I'm a man who knows when a fence is built to steal water instead of hold cattle. The tension in the room was now a physical thing, a pressure against the eardrums. It was at this moment that the bailiff returned, followed by 6 grim-faced men in homespun clothes, each carrying a rifle, the Mistral Town militia. They took up positions along the walls, their presence a quiet counterpoint to Kane's gunmen at the door. "Your Honor," Davies said, sensing the momentum shifting. "My client, Mr. Voss, is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. These are the wild accusations of a runaway thief, a federal busybody, and a reclusive rancher. They have no credible first-hand witness to any actual crime. On that point, Mr. Davies," Judge Bellwether said, a dangerous glint in her eye. "I believe you are mistaken." She nodded to the bailiff. "Bring him in." The side door opened again. 2 of Olive's armed postal riders entered, and between them was a small, terrified-looking man with spectacles and a nervous twitch. "Lyle Briscoe," Ivy whispered. Briscoe looked like a cornered rabbit. His eyes darted from Voss to Kane, and then to the floor. Voss's mask of calm finally cracked. A flicker of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his face before he suppressed it. "Mr. Briscoe," the judge said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You are the paymaster who signed these disbursement vouchers." Briscoe could only nod. A pathetic, jerking movement. "And did you, in fact, pay wages to Jacob Miller and Thomas Finch in the year 1883? Briscoe swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Voss, who gave him a look of pure menace. He looked at Kane, who smiled a cold, thin smile. He looked ready to faint. "He is being intimidated." "Your Honor," Ivy said, stepping forward. She held up a single, creased piece of paper. "Perhaps this will help his memory. Olive's riders found this in his boarding house. It is a letter, addressed to his mother back in Ohio. He never mailed it." She handed the letter to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Bellwether read it silently, her expression unreadable. Then she looked down at Lyle Briscoe. "In this letter, Mr. Briscoe, you tell your mother that you are in a great deal of trouble. You say, and I quote, 'I have been made to do things. Mother, things with the company books. Mr. Voss said it was just business. But I have signed my name to payments for men I know are dead. He said if I ever spoke of it, Mr. Kane would see to it that my own name was added to that list." The color drained from Briscoe's face. A small, choked sob escaped him. It was over. The lie had collapsed. Ephraim Voss stood up. He ignored his lawyer, who was frantically trying to pull him back down. He addressed the judge directly, his voice a low, reasonable purr that did not match the cold fury in his eyes. "Judge Bellwether, this is a small court, in a small town. These are large, complicated business matters. They should not be made more complicated than they need to be. A man of my stature, with my resources, can be a great friend to a town like Mistral, or a great enemy." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of commerce. Ada Bellwether leaned forward, her steel-gray eyes locking with his. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. "The law is not measured by the size of the court, but by the length of the shadow that the truth casts." She straightened up and picked up her gavel. "This court hereby issues an immediate injunction against the Voss-Holden syndicate. The fences blocking access to the Silver Wash are to be removed within 24 hours. All assets related to the Kite's Bluff Depot are to be frozen. A full, formal hearing on the charges of fraud, conspiracy, and extortion will be held in this courtroom in 10 days' time." She brought the gavel down with a sharp, final crack. "This preliminary hearing is adjourned." For a moment, no one moved. Then Voss turned. He walked past his stunned lawyer and paused beside Sutter Kane at the door. He leaned in close, and though his voice was a whisper, in the dead silence of the room, Ivy and Rowan heard it clearly. "Burn it," Voss hissed. "Burn the proof, burn the ranch, erase it all." His eyes, cold and black as his onyx ring, met Rowan's across the room. They held a promise of absolute, fiery annihilation. Then he was gone, Kane and his men melting away behind him. As the townspeople began to file out, talking in excited, hushed tones, Judge Bellwether called Ivy to the bench. "Miss Durant," she said, her voice losing its judicial iron and taking on a tone of genuine concern. "Voss will not wait for the hearing. You are in mortal danger. You cannot stay in town." "She can come back with me," Rowan said, stepping to Ivy's side. "To Starfall Range. It's open country. Hard to approach without being seen. It's defensible." The judge nodded. "A wise decision. Go now, and be careful." As they turned to leave, Olive Marrow caught Ivy's arm. She pressed a small, canvas mail pouch into Ivy's hand. "This came in this morning's delivery before we left," she said in a low voice. "It was marked undeliverable. There's no such address." Ivy looked at the front of the pouch. It was an invoice for a new shipment of blasting powder, and it was addressed to the Syndicate Depot, Kite's Bluff. It was the first piece of physical evidence that tied the name of their phantom fortress to the real world of commerce. It was the key. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright, unforgiving noon. The militiamen gave them a respectful nod. As they reached the buckboard, the bell in the small church across the town square began to toll 12, and in the shadows of the cottonwood trees, at the edge of town, they saw them. A dozen riders, their figures dark and indistinct in the shimmering heat. They were not moving. They were just watching, waiting. Their shadows stretched long across the dusty ground, like pools of spilled oil. The 10-day reprieve felt like a death sentence. The return to Starfall Range was heavy with a new kind of silence. The small victory in Judge Bellwether's courtroom felt hollow, a mere postponement of the inevitable. Voss's whispered command to Kane Byrne was not a possibility. It was a sentence. The 10 days the judge had granted them were not a reprieve, but a deadline for their destruction. Darkness fell not as a comfort, but as a shroud. The shadows that pooled at the base of the Needleback Mountains felt like an invading army. Under the cold, impartial light of a rising moon, Rowan and Ivy began to prepare for the fire. They worked with a grim, synchronized efficiency, a partnership forged in crisis. Rowan took the shovel. He began digging a wide, shallow trench around the perimeter of the barn and the small corral. A firebreak. His movements were rhythmic and powerful, the blade biting into the hard-baked earth, the sound a steady, lonely thud in the vast quiet. He would fill this trench with water from the well, a muddy barrier against the creeping, grassy flames he knew Kane would set. Ivy, her mind still buzzing with the day's events, took on a different task. She emptied the cold ashes from the kitchen stove into a bucket. With a fine sifter, she began to spread a thin, almost invisible layer of the gray powder on the packed earth in front of the cabin door, the barn entrance, and beneath the single window. It was a bookkeeper's trap. In the dark, a boot stepping in that soft, clinging ash would leave a perfect, telltale print, a silent alarm. They worked for hours, the cool night wind drying the sweat on their skin. Rowan finished the trench and began the back-breaking work of hauling water, bucket by bucket, turning the dry ditch into a ring of dark, reflective mud. Ivy, her hands and face smudged with soot, organized the interior of the cabin, moving the few flammable items, the kerosene can, the lamp oil, into a small, stone-lined pit Rowan had dug for cooling milk. Finally, there was nothing left to do but wait for the dawn, or for the torch. Rowan built a small fire in the stone-ringed pit on the porch, not for warmth, but for light and for the small comfort it offered against the oppressive dark. He sat on the familiar wooden bench, the Winchester leaning against the wall, close enough to touch. He was exhausted, but his senses were alive, every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. Ivy came out of the cabin, her hands scrubbed clean of the ash, but not of the ink. She had been studying the new invoice from Olive, the one addressed to Kite's Bluff, committing its details to memory. Her eyes were tired, the skin beneath them shadowed in the firelight, but they were bright with a fierce, unwavering light. She looked at Rowan, sitting alone on the bench, his shoulders slumped in a rare moment of weariness. and her heart ached with a feeling so new and so powerful it almost frightened her. She didn't sit on the step. She didn't take the empty chair. She pulled the small, three-legged stool from inside the cabin, the one she used to reach the high shelves, and placed it near the fire pit, close to him. The wind was cool, and it stirred her hair, and she shivered. Just once. She looked at him, and he looked at her. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were an invitation, the same one he had offered the night before. This was their new reality. This was their new normal. Ivy stood, and in a movement that was now as natural as breathing, as familiar as a habit learned over a lifetime, she moved to him. She didn't ask. She simply settled onto his lap, turning to face the fire, her side pressed against his chest. It was the same pose as before, but everything had changed. The first time, it had been a desperate search for shelter. This time, it was a deliberate choice. It was a homecoming, as she settled into his embrace, finding the perfect hollow to rest her head beneath his chin. Her skirt, creased and dusty from the courthouse, rode up slightly, the fabric catching, revealing the line of her leg to just above the knee. Neither of them acknowledged it. It was a simple fact, a small, intimate detail in a world that had become intensely, frighteningly real. Rowan's arms came around her. His hand settled at her waist, fingers splayed wide and firm, a solid, grounding presence. He held her as if she were made of both iron and glass. His other hand rested on her back, his thumb rubbing a slow, comforting circle between her shoulder blades, supporting her. He pulled her closer, until there was no space left between them, only the shared warmth of their bodies against the cold night air. They sat in silence, watching the flames. Then Ivy tilted her head back, looking up at him. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning them the color of warm whiskey. He lowered his head. The kiss was not like the first one. The first had been a question, a whisper of gratitude. This one was an answer. It was a statement. It was slow and deep and overwhelmingly certain. It was a kiss of profound, unshakable trust. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was the taste of smoke and dust and the pure, clean essence of the man who held her. His lips were firm, yet gentle, and he kissed her as if he were memorizing her, as if he were trying to pour all of his strength, all of his stubborn endurance, into her. Their breath mingled, warm and sweet, a shared life in the face of the threatened fire. When they finally broke apart, they didn't move. Ivy rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. She was trembling, but not from cold, not from fear. It was the tremor of an emotion too large for her body to hold. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice thick, her breath brushing his lips. "If this house burns tomorrow, if they come and they burn everything we've prepared, the one thing left standing must be us." The words were not a plea. They were a vow, a demand. Rowan's response was not in words. It was in the sudden, fierce tightening of his arms. It was a grip that was possessive, protective, and absolute. It was not rough. It did not harm. It was the grip of a man anchoring himself, a man who had been adrift for 7 years and had just found solid land. His hand on her back was a vice of pure devotion, a silent, powerful answer. "We will be." A sudden sharp gust of wind swept across the porch, and the brass wind chimes rang out. A frantic, beautiful cacophony. In the midst of their deadly serious preparations, the sound was so absurdly normal, so cheerful, that they both laughed. The sound was startled out of them, a release of tension that was sharp and real. Ivy, still smiling, captured his hand, the large, calloused one that rested at her waist. She lifted it, turned it, and pressed his open palm flat against her chest, directly over her heart. She held it there, her own hand covering his, pressing his touch into her. Her heart hammered against his palm, a fast, strong rhythm, a drumbeat of life. "Here," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. "This is the safe. This is where the truth is. Right here." The moment stretched, perfect and profound. They were two people, a fire, and a universe of stars above. But the night was waiting. The threat was still real. Slowly, as if moving from a dream, they both stood. The spell was not broken, but it was set aside. The intimacy of the moment flowed seamlessly into the practicality of their next move. Their actions were now in perfect harmony with their feelings. To love was to prepare. To prepare was to protect. To protect was to fight. "The evidence," Rowan said, his voice a low rumble. Ivy nodded. She went into the cabin. The small, iron-bound strongbox was hidden behind a false panel in the wall, a place Rowan's father had built to store deeds. It was small, but it was sturdy. Ivy took her ledger, the Saltfinch Hollow vouchers, and the new invoice from Kite's Bluff, the paper arrow pointing to Voss's fortress, and placed them inside. She closed the heavy lid and turned the key. She handed the key to Rowan. He didn't put it in his pocket. He walked to the small, carved wooden box on the mantel, the one that held Caleb's memory. He dropped the small brass key inside, where it nestled against a faded ribbon and a polished agate. He closed the lid. The word, "Stay facing out." The proof was secured. The key was safe, guarded by the spirit of the ranch itself. They were walking back to the porch when they saw it. A faint, distant light from the north, from Miller's Ridge. It wasn't a mirror this time. It was a pinprick of fire, small and controlled. It flared once, twice, then a third time, and then, a mile to the east of it, another fire answered. Olive. And the militia. The signal was grim. It meant the arsonists were on the move. They were gathering. Rowan stepped onto the porch and looked out over the basin. The night was painfully, cruelly beautiful. The moon was so bright it bleached the color from the land, painting the world in shades of silver and black. In the low-lying fields by the dry wash, 1,000 fireflies had risen, a shimmering, magical cloud of cold. Green light, it looked like a field of fallen stars, a peaceful, perfect scene that belied the human darkness moving toward them. "They're coming," Rowan said. Ivy moved to stand beside him. She was no longer the frightened woman from the buckboard. She wore a light leather jacket over her dress, and her hair was tied back in a tight, practical knot at the nape of her neck. She looked like a soldier. Rowan pulled on his long, canvas duster, the one that smelled of dust and distance. He checked the rigging on his Winchester, the smooth, worn action of the lever. He had sworn to himself he would not take a life. He would aim for horses, for hands, for the torches themselves. He would stop the fire, not spill blood, but he knew in the cold, hard place in his gut that Sutter Kane would not offer the same courtesy. They stood side by side, facing the darkness, the wind chimes singing softly above their heads. Before they stepped off the porch to take their positions, Rowan in the barn's hayloft. Ivy by the cabin window, he reached for her. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He didn't kiss her. He simply took her hand, his large, rough fingers interlaced with her smaller, ink-stained ones. A perfect, tight fit. They stood like that for a full 10 seconds, hand in hand, looking out at the night. There were no words, no oaths of "be careful" or "I love you." There was only the firm, resolute pressure of his hand, and the equally firm, unyielding grip she returned. It was a silent acknowledgement. "I am responsible for you. You are responsible for me." Then, as one, they let go and turned to face the coming fire. They came out of the darkness like phantoms, not from the main trail, but from the low-lying arroyo to the south. Sutter Kane led them, a dozen men, their face hard and shadowed. They moved with a practiced, ugly silence. Rowan, watching from the hayloft, counted them, but he also saw a 13th figure, sitting on a horse on the ridge above, silhouetted against the stars. The man was still, an observer, not a participant. Ephraim Voss. His face was a pale, emotionless mask, as cold and distant as the needleback stone he resembled. Kane's men didn't carry torches. They carried buckets. They fanned out, creating a wide semicircle around the barn and the main corral. The beautiful, shimmering cloud of fireflies that had enchanted Ivy earlier scattered in panic as the men began their work, sloshing their buckets, painting the dry fence posts. the base of the corral, and the large, vulnerable hayrick with thick, black, glistening pine resin. The air, moments before smelling of sage and the promise of rain, now grew thick with the acrid, flammable stench. Kane took up a position near the main gate. He raised his hand, a silent signal, and one of his men near the hayrick pulled a sulfur match from his pocket, preparing to strike it. "Now," Rowan whispered to himself. He grabbed the heavy, greased wooden lever he had spent the afternoon rigging to the well's main pump mechanism. He put his full weight on it. The mechanism groaned, the gears bit, and deep below the earth, the pump drive engaged. A series of jury-rigged pipes, which Rowan had laid in the new trench, hissed to life. A heavy fan of water erupted from the ground, shooting in a high, broad arc. It wasn't a gentle spray. It was a pressurized, choking deluge from the deep, cold aquifer. It slammed into the hayrick, soaking the resin-coated hay and drenching the two men nearest to it. The water hit the fence line, washing the pine tar into the mud of the firebreak. The men yelled, a mixture of surprise and curses. As the icy water hit them, the match was never struck. What in the... Kane spun, staring at the impossible fountain of water. As the men scattered, scrambling away from the deluge, they ran directly across the patches of ground Ivy had prepared. She, watching from the cabin window, saw it all in the pale moonlight, their wet boots stamped into the thin layer of ash, leaving a perfect, sudden record of their movement. 8, 9, 10, they were all accounted for, their positions betrayed, their silent approach broken. Before Kane could reorganize his men, before he could give the order to draw their weapons, a new sound split the night. It was a high-pitched thwip, followed by a piercing whistle. From Miller's Ridge to the north, a single, bright object rocketed into the sky. It exploded, not with a bang, but with a brilliant, magnesium-white pop. A signal flare. It hung in the air, suspended by a small parachute, casting a harsh, unforgiving white light over the entire basin. Kane's men froze. They were no longer shadows. They were a dozen men, fully exposed, standing in a muddy field. Their buckets dropped at their feet. They looked around, their faces pale and stunned, suddenly realizing they were not the hunters, but the centerpiece of a lit stage. They hesitated, their bravado evaporating under that terrible, artificial sun. Sutter Kane was the first to recover. He was furious. His plan of a silent, terrifying, fire-raising operation ruined. He saw Ivy's silhouette in the window. With a roar of rage, he drew his revolver and fired. It was a warning shot, a blast of pure, frustrated malice. The bullet slammed into the porch post, inches from Ivy's head, sending a spray of wooden splinters into the cabin. Rowan's answer was immediate. From the hayloft. His Winchester barked. He didn't aim at Kane. He aimed at the old wooden sign that hung over the gate, the one he had altered. The 44, 40 round struck the sign dead center. The board, already brittle with age, exploded in a shower of splintered wood. It was a message, delivered with cold precision, far more terrifying than Kane's angry shot. I am not aiming at a post. I am aiming at a target. And I am not missing. Kane's men flinched, ducking for cover that wasn't there. They were pinned. In the cabin. Ivy grabbed the small signal mirror. She angled it at the moon, catching the light, and flashed it 3 times toward Yucca Draw, the dark, brush-filled wash to the east. It was the signal. Close the net. The answer came a second later, 3 short, sharp blasts from Olive Marrow's whistle. The sound of the whistle was a dam breaking. Suddenly, the night was filled with the sound of running feet and the rumble of a heavy wagon. From the east, Olive Marrow burst from the draw, leading a dozen armed militia, and from the main road, the townspeople, who had been waiting in a silent convoy, came flooding in. They weren't a mob. They were a practiced, organized team. They rolled the town's heavy leather fire hose, ramming the intake into the well's trough. Men and women formed a bucket brigade, a human chain of defiance, reinforcing Rowan's firebreak, their voices calling out in a steady, determined rhythm. On the ridge, Ephraim Voss saw it all. He saw the water, the flare, the militia, the townsfolk. He saw his numerical advantage vanish. His plan to burn and erase had not just failed. It had backfired spectacularly. He had intended to isolate and terrorize two people. Instead, he had united a community against him. His gaze shifted to the cabin. The fire was lost, but the proof was not. He leaned forward. Cain, his voice, thin and sharp, carried across the chaos. Forget the fire, get the ledger, get the book for Cain. This was a new, simpler mission. He abandoned any thought of the fire and, using the chaos as cover, sprinted directly at the cabin's front door. He hit it with his shoulder, the wood splintering, and burst into the main room. Ivy was waiting. She stood, not by the window, but by the far wall, her hand on a small, unassuming wooden knot in the paneling, the disguised handle of the hidden safe. Cain saw her and lunged, his face a mask of fury. "Give me the book, girl." As he crossed the room, Ivy didn't try to run. She simply pulled a thin, braided rope that hung, disguised as a drapery pull, from a hook on the wall. High above, in the rafters, a trigger released. A heavy 100-pound sandbag, which Rowan had positioned that afternoon, dropped from the ceiling. It slammed onto the floorboards in the narrow hallway that led to the room, exploding in a choking cloud of dust and sand. It didn't hit Cain, but it landed directly in his path. A sudden, blinding, and absolute obstacle. He crashed into the heavy bag, coughing, his eyes full of grit. It was only a temporary delay, but it was all Rowan needed. Rowan had dropped from the hayloft the second he saw Cain charge. He had entered through the back door, his rifle held at the ready. He met Cain as the man was trying to disentangle himself from the sandbag. Cain looked up, his eyes wide and full of grit, and tried to raise his revolver. He was too slow. Rowan's movements were fast, clean, and economical. He didn't shoot. He reversed his rifle, gripping the barrel, and swung the heavy, solid walnut stock in a short, hard arc. There was a dull, sickening thud of wood on metal and bone as the rifle butt connected with Cain's wrist and forearm. Cain screamed, a sharp, broken sound, and his revolver clattered uselessly to the floor. Before Cain could even register the pain, Rowan was on him, shoving him hard against the wall. He grabbed a set of looped leather reins from a peg by the door, and with a series of quick, brutal twists, bound Cain's hands behind his back. It was over in less than 5 seconds. No serious injury, but a total, humiliating defeat. From his vantage point on the ridge, Ephraim Voss saw his last, best weapon, his fang, neutralized. He saw his enforcer being dragged, bound and protesting, from the cabin. It was over. His entire meticulously crafted empire of paper and fear was collapsing. Voss didn't hesitate. He didn't wait to be captured. He yanked his horse's head around, spurred it viciously, and fled. He didn't ride back toward town, or toward the south. He rode northeast, at a dead gallop, toward the barren, empty lands that hid his last secret. He rode for Kite's Bluff. Olive Marrow, who was directing the last of the Bucket Brigade, saw the lone rider break from the ridge. "It's Voss! He's running for the den!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the noise. She pointed at 2 of her best riders, men who knew the territory. "You 2 follow him, he's running to his money, and to the other books, do not lose him." The 2 men peeled away from the crowd, their horses leaping forward, a desperate, 2-man pursuit disappearing into the night. The small, threatening fires that had been set in the grass were all out, beaten into the dirt by wet sacks and angry boots. The great hayrick was soaked, its resin washed away. The cabin roof, where a few embers had landed, was scorched black in patches, but it had not caught. The smell of burnt pine and acrid resin was thick in the air, and then a new smell joined it. The clean, sharp, electric scent of ozone, the smell of rain on hot, dry earth. A single, fat drop of water struck the dusty porch, then another and another, as if the flare had punctured the sky itself, a rare, unseasonable, and blessed shower of rain began to fall. It hissed as it hit the scorched patches of grass. The townsfolk, their faces smudged with soot and sweat, turned their heads to the sky and let out a ragged, joyful cheer. Sutter Kane, his face a mask of silent, murderous fury, was led away by the militia. He was done. Ivy leaned against the porch post, the adrenaline draining out of her so fast her knees felt weak. She looked at her hands. The back of her left hand, where she had brushed against the wall to avoid Kane, was smeared with a thick, black, sticky glob of the pine resin. She tried to rub it off, but it only spread. Rowan walked up to her, his duster dark with rain, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He saw her struggling with the resin. He said nothing. He simply tucked his rifle under his arm, pulled his own bandana from his pocket, and dipped it in the clean, fresh rain that was now gurgling from the rain barrel. He took her hand. His own was large, rough, and calloused, but his touch was impossibly gentle. He began to work at the sticky mess, carefully, patiently, wiping the black resin from her skin. Ivy stood perfectly still, watching his head, bowed over his task. She watched his large, strong hand perform this small, tender act of care, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. A single, quiet moment of peace in the absolute center of the storm. Olive Merrow walked up, wiping her own sooty face. She nodded at the bound form of Kane being loaded onto a wagon. Then she looked northeast, into the rain, where her riders had disappeared. "Well," she said, her voice grim but satisfied. "We put out the fire. Pike." She looked at Rowan and Ivy, her gaze taking in the scene between them. The quiet intimacy of the simple act. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "Voss is running to his money, to the real books." She clapped Rowan on the shoulder, pulling him from his task. "Now it's time to go to the den." Kite's Bluff was a masterpiece of misdirection, a fortress whose greatest defense was its own apparent worthlessness. To the casual eye, it was just another abandoned salt depot, a collapsing skeleton of weathered wood slowly surrendering to the wind and sun. But the two militia riders Olive had sent after Voss were not casual observers. They had tracked him here, and when Rowan, Ivy, and Olive arrived with a small, hand-picked contingent of the militia, they found the riders' horses hidden, their report grim and certain. Voss was inside. This was not a place for a frontal assault. This was a place for a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Following the riders' scouting report, Rowan led their small party himself, Ivy, Olive, and two of the quietest, steadiest militiamen to a narrow, brush-choked ravine behind the main structure. Halfway up the rock face, concealed by a thick growth of cat-claw acacia, was a small, grated opening, a ventilation shaft for the lower levels. Rowan, using a crowbar from his saddlebags, pried the rusty grate free with a single, silent flex of his muscles. The shaft was narrow, dark, and smelled of cold limestone and stale air. They went in one by one, Rowan first, dropping into the darkness, then helping the others down. They found themselves in a narrow, rock-cut tunnel from the main chamber beyond. They could hear the muffled sounds of movement, the scrape of a heavy object on a stone floor, and the low, urgent murmur of voices. Ivy held up a hand, motioning for silence. She closed her eyes, tilting her head, her entire being focused on the sounds. She listened to the cadence of the footsteps, the heavy, rhythmic tread of men under strain. She heard a pause, then a new set of steps, lighter, less weary. She opened her eyes, her whisper barely disturbing the air. "They're working in shifts. 2 men. The steps change every 12 minutes, almost to the second. There's a guard change coming." She looked at Rowan, a plan already formed in her sharp, analytical mind. They would move on the change. They waited in the suffocating darkness of the tunnel. The 12 minutes felt like an eternity. Finally, they heard the shuffle of feet, a muttered exchange, and then the heavy tread of the relieved guards moving away. "Now," Ivy breathed. They moved from the tunnel into the main chamber. It was not a depot. It was a vault. The old salt works was just a facade. a hollow shell. Behind a false wooden wall was a cavernous cellar carved from the natural limestone, lit by a dozen lanterns, and it was filled with money. Canvas sacks, brimming with coins and bundled banknotes, were stacked against the walls like firewood. This was the syndicate's heart, the hidden treasury that fueled their conquest of the basin. In the center of the room, Ephraim Voss was in a state of controlled panic. He was not a man who dirtied his own hands, but desperation had stripped him of that luxury. He and two remaining loyalists were heaving the last of the canvas sacks into a massive, iron-strapped strongbox on heavy iron wheels, a portable safe. His escape plan was clear. He was liquidating his assets, loading his stolen fortune into a movable vault to be hauled across the New Mexico border, beyond the reach of Judge Bellwether's jurisdiction. He was operating on the belief that Starfall Range was a smoking ruin, that the primary evidence against him had been turned to ash, as her companions fanned out, taking positions in the shadows. Ivy's eyes were not on the money. They were on the bags themselves. Her gaze sharpened. She noticed that several of the canvas sacks being loaded into the safe had a distinctive, dark stain near the bottom seams, a greasy black mark. It was an oil stain, and she recognized it. It was the same unique, high-viscosity lubricant used on the syndicate's proprietary water pump at the Silverwash Dam, the one that was draining the life from the neighboring ranches. It was a small detail, but it was everything. It was the physical, tangible link between the stolen water and the stolen money. Voss, his face slick with sweat, his fine suit stained with dust, gave a final, desperate order. "That's the last of it. Get the lid closed. We move now." His men slammed the heavy iron lid shut and began to slide the thick locking bolts into place. The safe was on a slight incline, positioned to be rolled up a heavy wooden ramp and onto a waiting freight wagon hidden outside. Voss and his men put their shoulders to the heavy box. "Push," Voss grunted, his voice raw. "Push, you fools," as they strained, their muscles bulging. Rowan moved. He was a shadow detaching from other shadows. In his hand was a small, flat piece of iron, a wedge he'd taken from the broken door of the depot. He didn't throw it. He didn't make a sound. He crept forward and, just as the safe began to slowly, groaning, roll forward, he slid the wedge onto the stone floor, directly in the path of the front left wheel. Voss gave another roar of effort. Together now the heavy iron wheel rolled forward another foot. It hit the wedge. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The wheel, unable to roll over the unyielding iron, stopped dead. But the immense momentum of the multi-ton safe did not. With a sound like a cannon shot, the cast iron axle, subjected to an impossible twisting pressure, snapped. The safe lurched violently. The entire massive box tilted, balanced for a heart-stopping second on two wheels, and then crashed onto its side with a thunderous, ground-shaking boom. The locking bolts, not fully seated, sheared off. The heavy lid burst open, and a river of silver and paper poured out onto the limestone floor. Coins eagles, double eagles. Silver dollars spun and skittered into every corner of the room, a shower of ill-gotten rain. Bundles of banknotes, their paper bands snapping, burst apart, sending greenbacks fluttering through the air like terrified birds. The crash was the signal. Olive Marrow's whistle cut through the ringing in their ears. A sharp, piercing cry. The two militiamen rose from the shadows, their rifles leveled. "Drop it! Voss, it's over!" Voss's two men threw their hands up instantly, their nerve broken. But Voss was made of something colder, more reptilian. He dove for the scattered money, not for the gold, but for a single, leather-bound satchel that had been sitting atop the safe. The secondary ledgers, the real books. He snatched it, drew a small, silver-plated derringer from his coat, and fired a wild shot that ricocheted harmlessly off the ceiling. He wasn't trying to hit anyone. He was creating a diversion. He spun and sprinted, not for the main entrance, but for a dark, narrow opening in the far wall, a secret tunnel. The books, Ivy screamed, not in fear, but in fury. She ran after him. Rowan started to follow, but Ivy was faster. her smaller frame moving through the chaos with a desperate, focused grace. She wouldn't reach him in time. Voss was already at the tunnel's entrance, but Ivy saw it. Leaning against the wall was a long pole with a wicked-looking iron hook on the end, a tool used for hauling blocks of salt. Without breaking stride, she grabbed it. It was heavy, awkward. She didn't try to use it as a weapon. Voss was 2 steps from the darkness. Ivy planted her feet, swung the heavy pole in a low, clean arc, and let go. It flew through the air, end over end. The hook didn't hit Voss. It snagged the leather strap of the satchel he was clutching. The sudden, violent jerk nearly tore Voss's arm from its socket. He cried out in pain and surprise as the satchel was ripped from his grasp. It flew through the air, landing on the dusty floor halfway between them. Voss hesitated for a split second, his eyes on the books, but the sound of Rowan and Olive's running footsteps behind him made his decision. He abandoned the satchel and plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. At that exact moment, a new sound began to penetrate the stone walls, a sound from the outside world. It was a deep, resonant, and relentless tolling. The church bell from Mistral. It was not a call to prayer. It was an alarm, a summons. Judge Bellwether, trusting her instincts, had sent the town posse. The law was no longer a distant promise in a courtroom. It was a physical presence, arriving at their gates. Rowan didn't pursue Voss. He ran to Ivy's side as she snatched the precious satchel from the floor. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands hovering, not quite touching her, as if afraid she might break. She just nodded, clutching the books to her chest as if they were a living thing. "The tunnel," Olive said, gesturing with her shotgun. "It has to come out somewhere." The tunnel was short, a simple bolt hole. It emerged from the rock onto a narrow, wind-swept ledge overlooking a steep, treacherous scree slope that fell away for 200 feet to the basin floor below. Ephraim Voss was trapped. Rowan stood in the tunnel's mouth, blocking his only way back. Below, they could see the posse, a dozen riders, fanning out, their progress slow but certain. Voss stood on the precipice, his fine suit torn, his face bleeding from a scratch, his composure finally, completely shattered. He looked at Rowan, his face a mask of pure, distilled hatred. "This is what you don't understand, rancher," he hissed, his voice thin and ragged against the wind. "There is only one law out here, the law of the man who controls the water. I had it. I owned it. It was mine." Rowan took a single step out onto the ledge. He was not angry. He was calm, his voice as steady as the rock beneath his feet. "You're wrong, Voss," he said. "There's only the law of the man who makes a choice. You chose greed. We chose to stand. Defeat, absolute and undeniable, settled over Voss." He looked down the sheer drop, then back at Rowan's implacable face. He would not surrender. He would not be taken. He made a desperate, final gamble. He threw himself from the ledge, not into the empty air, but onto the steep, shifting slope of loose rock and gravel. He didn't fall. He slid, tumbling end over end in a chaotic, uncontrolled descent, a cloud of dust and stone billowing around him. He was alive when the posse reached him at the bottom, a broken, bruised, and bleeding man, his fine suit in tatters. His reign ended not with a bang, but with the cold, final click of iron handcuffs. On the ledge above, Ivy stepped out of the tunnel and into the cool night air. She was still clutching the satchel of ledgers to her chest. She looked at Rowan, and the relief that washed over her was so immense it was almost painful. Her eyes, shining in the moonlight, were filled with a mixture of triumphant joy and a trust so deep, so absolute, it was a tangible thing. As they stood there, silhouetted against the night, a single, brilliant meteor blazed a trail across the sky, a final, fiery exclamation point on the night's events. Olive Marrow stepped onto the ledge beside them, a wry, tired smile on her face. She looked at the captured Voss below, then up at the fading trail of the meteor. "Well," she said, nudging Ivy with her elbow, "looks like the sky is co-signing the arrest warrant tonight." The final trial of Ephraim Voss was a quiet, almost solemn affair. The small courtroom was packed, but the air of menace was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. Sutter Kane, his arm in a sling and his face a mask of sullen fury, was led away in irons before the proceedings even began. Voss, looking diminished in a borrowed, ill-fitting suit, stood before Judge Ada Bellwether not as a titan of industry, but as a common fraud. With Ivy's captured ledgers and the Kite's Bluff invoice spread before her, Judge Bellwether delivered her verdict. Her voice, crisp and clear, filled every corner of the room. Every phantom debt levied against the ranchers of the Sage Glass Basin was declared null and void. The fraudulent land deeds were rescinded. Ephraim Voss was sentenced to repay every dollar he had extorted, a sum so vast it would strip him of his fortune, and to serve 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. The final, and most important, decree was the simplest: the dam at Silver Wash was to be dismantled, and the water returned to the people. A wave of quiet, profound relief washed through the courtroom. It wasn't a loud cheer, but a collective sigh, the sound of a community that had forgotten how to breathe, finally drawing a full, clean breath. In the aftermath, Ivy Durant was not only cleared of all charges, but her name became a symbol of integrity. A town meeting was held, and from the ashes of the syndicate's greed, a new entity was born, the Silver Wash Cooperative, an association of local ranchers dedicated to the fair and communal management of the basin's most precious resource. They offered her the only position they knew she was qualified for, and the only one she wanted treasurer. Rowan, in a gesture that surprised everyone but Ivy, brought his hand-drawn buckskin map to the first cooperative meeting. He unrolled the secret history of the basin's water and offered it not for a price, but as a gift, in return. He asked for only one thing: the right to keep the well at Starfall Range open to any traveler in need during the dry seasons. A promise of sanctuary in a thirsty land. A week later, the ranchers gathered at the head of the now flowing Silver Wash. They tore down the last of the syndicate's fences. In its place, they erected a new sign, made of freshly planed cottonwood. The letters were painted in a neat, clear script, the same elegant hand that had once filled a fraudulent ledger. The words were Ivy's. The nails that held it fast against the wind were driven home by Rowan's hammer. The sign read, "Water belongs to those who keep it with honesty." That evening, a profound peace settled over Starfall Range. The frantic energy of the chase, the trial, the fire, had finally dissipated, leaving behind a deep, resonant quiet. Rowan sat on the porch bench, his work shirt open at the collar, watching the sky soften for evening. The air was still, and the wind chimes were silent. The cabin door opened, and Ivy stepped out. She wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, and her hair, free of pins and dust, hung loose over her shoulders, shining in the golden light. She looked at him, and a slow, easy smile touched her lips. She walked to the bench, and he watched her, his heart a slow, steady drum in his chest. She didn't sit beside him, as she had twice before. She climbed onto his lap, a movement now so familiar it felt like a ritual, an unspoken creed. This time, it was not to shield herself from the wind, or to seek comfort from fear. This time, it was simply a choice to be home. Her skirt fell in a soft pool of blue over her knees as she wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers lacing together behind his head. Rowan's arms encircled her, his large, warm hand settling on the small of her back, pulling her close until they were a single silhouette against the fading light. He kissed her. It was a long, slow, deep kiss, a conversation without words. It spoke of trust earned through fire, of affection that had grown in the most barren of soils, and of the profound, unshakable safety of a shared roof. It was the kiss of a man and a woman who were not just building a life, but had become the foundation of each other's. When they parted, they remained in their embrace, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. They began to speak, their voices low whispers, planning a future that had, only days ago, been an impossible dream. "The small room," he murmured, his breath warm against her cheek, "the one with the morning sun." We could put a desk in there, and shelves. A book room, she whispered back, a note of wonder in her voice. For the cooperative's ledgers, and maybe, for teaching the Henderson children their sums. They have no school. And the old, smaller barn, he continued, his thumb stroking her back. I could add 2 new stalls, for travelers. No one should have to fear the dry season. Their words were not grand pronouncements, but small, sturdy bricks, a classroom, a stable, the quiet, ordinary work of building a world together. A soft, familiar sound broke their reverie, 3 sharp taps on the porch post. They looked up. Olive Marrow stood there, a wide grin on her leathery face. In her hand, she held a large wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. She didn't intrude. She simply set the basket down on the top step. First delivery for the cooperative's new treasurer, she said, her voice full of rough affection. She laid a folded note on top of the basket. We're forming up. Meetings tomorrow. She gave them a wink that held a universe of understanding, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the twilight, leaving the sky and the night. To them, the stars emerged, a brilliant, silent congregation. The wind stirred, and the chimes above them began to sing a soft, gentle lullaby. Ivy tilted her head back, her eyes reflecting the endless night sky. She rested her forehead against his once more. I used to be afraid of numbers. Rowan, she said, her voice soft with revelation. I saw them as weapons, but now I think I love them again, because you believed in what they meant. You believed they could tell the truth. A slow smile spread across Rowan's face, a smile that seemed to erase the 7 long years of solitude. He held her tighter, as if he could absorb her into himself. I was alone for 7 years. Ivy, he answered, his voice a low, gravelly murmur filled with a wonder of its own. And I think it was all just to learn how to welcome you home in a single night. The camera of the mind pulls back, leaving the 2 figures on the porch, a single, unified shape against the immensity of the desert night. It drifts over the quiet ranch, the full water trough, reflecting the brilliant, scattered stars. The cabin door, left slightly ajar, a sliver of warm lamplight spilling into the darkness. The camera moves inside, to the small, iron-bound strongbox hidden behind the wall. It is no longer filled with the heavy ledgers of a dark conspiracy. It is empty, save for a single, folded piece of paper. On it is a note, the one that had been pushed under their door so long ago. A threat that had become a promise, and beside it, in Ivy's elegant script, 2 names have been added. Rowan Ivy, the choice to stay. You leave this story with the lingering taste of wood smoke, with the clean scent of rain on hot, dry earth, and with a quiet understanding. In a land as harsh and unforgiving as the Wild West, the most precious things, truth, justice, and love, do not survive on their own. They need a shelter, a safe harbor against the storm. They need a porch to sit on, a roof to keep them dry. And together, against all odds, they had finally built one. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it a little extra support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.